Episode 16, Blissinformation. Once upon a time, when the Hungarian city of Budapest was just plain Buda, there lived a handsome prince named Casimir. He lived in Buda Castle, which at the time, the end of the 9th century AD, was little more than a wooden fort perched precariously on top of the imposing rock of Castle Hill. From there, he could look down over the river Danube and across the marshy flatlands of Pest. But his view rarely strayed in that direction. If he craned his neck, he could look along the line of Buda Hill to the next rocky outcrop. There he saw a pinnacle of stone with another fort above which floated the flag of the hated horse Duke János. Casimir knew him as Uncle János, although he was at most a distant relative and just about the least uncle-y person you could imagine. It's not that János enjoyed violence, more that he was the closest thing to the personal embodiment of violence you could ever have the misfortune to meet. There was little malice in him, but if you happened to stand between him and whatever he wanted at that particular time, you might as well accept the fact that your head would soon cease to be on nodding, or even rolling, acquaintance with the rest of your body. János wanted a lot of things, and many people were in the way. He made no secret of his desire to usurp Casimir's father and his status of king of the Magyars. Thus, the handsome young prince was very much in harm's way, because János clearly saw him as private enemy number 2. But the horse Duke had one chink in his armor. His daughter Anna. She was now the only link János had left with his late beloved wife. He guarded Anna by day and by night, particularly since she turned 15. There are some sexual vices the 1970s did not invent, and the roaring 890s could, and possibly did, teach them a thing or two. The argument went that the age of consent should have been lower for people like Anna, who lived at a time when life expectancy was little more than 30, a state of affairs in which her father played no small part. As a small child, Casimir had spent 2 years as a guest of János. For guests read hostage, and he played with the toddler Anna. Over a decade on, the young prince and his childhood friend had developed in all sorts of ways, but the desire to play together had not diminished. This was definitely not part of her father's plans, but she was surrounded by impregnable fortifications and a plethora of hot and cold running guards. János particularly liked the sound of impregnable. The tale goes on to tell at length how, in this case, love conquers all, at least for a while. There was much talk of climbing wisteria and ladders made of bedding, but their precarious, not to say vertiginous trysts had not allowed for any other sort of bedding, so they decided to elope and travel west in search of freedom and kinder people. But they were betrayed by the very people they trusted, and their elopement only loped as far as the bridge which, even to this day, spans the ravine between the two castles, with the sound of war horses approaching from both sides of the geographic and political divide. The ill-starred couple stood on the parapet and held hands as they plunged headfirst towards their few seconds of freedom. The spot where they landed is now a little garden with a simple stone engraved with their names and the inscription "Together at last." Rough-hewn stones form a staircase up to the bridge, enabling the modern tourist to follow the lovers' trajectory, albeit in reverse and less traumatic order. Except you can't. The offer of a traveller's guide and amanuensis to the historical and most beautiful city of Budapest had his reasons for including this romance in his guidebook to the city. Such publications were very much in their infancy in 1797, and his was a classic example of the new genre. It bore the name of one of the great publishing houses who saw this as an opportunity to establish itself as a leader in the market for the burgeoning grand tourist. Sales were slow for the first few years, but it soon became an embarrassing success, so successful that the misuse of the word amanuensis temporarily became acceptable. The publication started a trend towards guidebooks of other cities and countries. It eventually helped divert attention away from the exclusively Italian focus of the Grand Tour, but that took a good few years. It was touted by the unnamed author as a celebration of Budapest's millennium, 1,000 years since its foundation. Except it wasn't. The anonymous writer has some questions to answer, even though he is long since dead, although he is not as dead as you might think, or necessarily as male as he describes himself. Questions like this. How can a success be described as embarrassing? When is a door not a door? When it's a brick wall? And when is a guide not a guide? How can the romance bear almost no resemblance to anything coming out of Hungary? How can the story have recognizable links to folk tales from Scandinavia, France, and wait for it, China? How come the author's maths is so bad that he was 100 years too early with his millennium celebrations? For that matter, how can the nameless author, let's call him anonymous but, recommend visits to ravines and bridges that do not exist and never have, or meals at an ancient but entirely fictitious hostelry where you can partake of the national dish, goulash, a thick beef stew? Wrong again, my erroneous friend. No matter how you spell it, if it doesn't have the consistency of soup and it isn't made with pork, it ain't Hungarian goulash, and so it goes on for 438 pages. It may well be the world's most untrustworthy guide, but there is one compensation of taking the book along. You would return from your oddly confusing holiday with biceps the size of Arnold Schwarzenegger. That is, rather, the size of Arnold Schwarzenegger's biceps. I am used to proofreading reports, and I think I'm pretty good at it, mostly because I make so many mistakes in the first place. Logging errors in the manuscript is a good starting point. But in the case of the leather-bound tome of Mr. Butcher's Budapest, I soon had to change tack. It was much quicker to list the accuracies and to make the logical assumption that most of the unverifiable facts were untrue. I found about 500 true statements, an average of only just one per page. These acted as the factual canvas on which the largely fictional guide was embroidered. So what, I hear you say, if I had a voice, I would have joined you. As it turns out, the answer is, so quite a lot. I am not talking about the inadvisability of relying on a guidebook that is massively out of date, especially in a city which didn't reach its architectural and cultural pinnacle for another 100 years. At the time of Budapest's real millennium celebrations in the late 1890s. I am not suggesting that you tuck the heavy book under your arm and strut around the land of Johnny Foreigner like some garishly trousered Tory. The city centre now boasts many grand edifices, including the world's most beautiful Parliament building, which is like our Houses of Parliament on steroids. But that's still not the point. Everything leads back to one undeniable fact. Our eponymous anonymous Butch had never been to Budapest. The nearest he got was Antwerp. For that fine city, he wrote a perfectly good if rather lyrical guidebook. But I fear you may have spotted a blue bottle in the ointment. Surely, nobody would nowadays use this old tome when there are up-to-date books and hundreds of web pages perfectly suited to the information needs of the 21st century traveller, right? Wrong. It only took a little light pilfering in the next generation of Budapest guidebooks to spread old Anonymous's lies, and for them to become part of the folklore of Budapest. The links to the original source soon disappeared, and the factoids became indistinguishable from the increasingly accurate information that surrounded them. I can only assume that authors who perpetuate Mr. B's pre-truth contributions, that's lawyers speak for lies, wanted to spice things up with a little local color. Whatever the reason, you will still find articles on the internet which tell the bogus story of the bridge-swooning lovers. To this day, you will see tourists from Mongolia and Manchester wandering the streets searching in vain for a restaurant called ShareAlike, and when they settle on the nearest available alternative, you will hear muttered complaints that the delicious soup-like pork goulash is nothing like the dish described on their bit of the internet, even when the physical evidence overwhelmingly points to the contrary. Many visitors will look at their printouts and say, but it's all here in black and white. Unfortunately, lies hang around the internet like a fart in a Volkswagen. It's easy to publish stuff and watch it go COVID. But then it's impossible to unsay it. By the time you realize your mistake, the damage is done. Someone in Omsk, in Kigali and someone in Slippery Rock, Arkansas will have picked it up and run with it. Now it's too late to put the genie back in the bottle or the cat back in the bag. In our modern society, we are all learning that lies are just about the only thing to have a long shelf life. Although fans of microbead plastics and nuclear waste may contest that. But conspiracy theories, both feet-in-mouth gaffes and just plain Olympic-sized stupidity, are set to swamp out all rivals. When the self-styled leader of the free world advises people to inject themselves with poison, you know you're in trouble. For centuries, we have reaped the benefits of the Renaissance. Now it's time for the more Renaissance. But none of these problems are new, or caused primarily by the internet. Some people will always look for the easy option, and it doesn't come much easier than taking someone else's work and claiming it as your own. I have invented a handy word for this process, which I call plagiarism. It has been turned into an industry by millions of us, the disciples of the mighty Lord Bill Gates, the god of cotton paste. Yet some of the best examples come from the old analog era, when intellectual larceny was an altogether slower affair. The oldies had time to think of clever solutions, which we could add to our modern defenses. Perhaps we are currently over-reliant on anti-plagiarism software, which will inevitably be hacked or circumvented. Here's just one way the future may be able to learn from the past. Back in the days when sat-nav wasn't invented and bacon wasn't wet, people used to find their way around towns with the help of paper maps, bundled together into books called things like A to Z, Bartholomew's and Motorlanders. Like its friends and most of its rivals, the Motorlander family had little scope for protecting their maps and the painstaking research that went into making them. Any crook with a photocopier could produce copies at a fraction of the cost, and even if the genuine map makers were willing to take their claim all the way to the courts, there was no guarantee that their expensive litigation would be successful. If the plagiarists stuck to their story that they had the skills and the diligence needed to create the maps from scratch, the genuine cartographers would find it hard to prove that they were being ripped off, until some clever mapmaker had an idea. Once the next edition of the book was ready to publish, they would locate a few grey areas, where the maps were a little vague. Big cities have plenty of unfinished housing estates, derelict industrial parks, lock-up garages and the like. In the map books, these are shown as white rather than grey spaces. Then these experts, usually so meticulous and precise, would have a little fun. They would simply add a few bogus streets at random in various locations and name them after their children, or ingredients for shepherd's pie, or retired American athletes, that kind of thing. Just a couple, tucked away amongst all those genuine street names, and nothing guessable like Let's-Be Avenue. If the forgers produced their maps containing any of these phony names, their fraud was suddenly laid bare to everyone, even the lawyers. A few foolhardy scammers tried to find the made-up names and delete them from their copies, but it was like finding a needle in a haystack. The counterfeit map business was no longer easy pickings, and the crooks got out of the market just in time for the whole industry to be decimated by satellite technology. Nevertheless, the map saga is an example of a triumph over plagiarism, however short-lived. Such basic common sense and cunning will be vital as we humans become increasingly marginalized from the business of running the world. So take the advice from someone already living in the margins. If you want to know about Budapest, go to Budapest and make your own impressions. For day-to-day use, by all means use sat-nav, but treat it as just another tool, like a microwave or an orbital sander. But if you want to experience something new, get on your feet and make some new memories of your own. And for heaven's sake, don't take everything you see at face value. Do you really want to get your values from a gun-toting, incest-ridden wacko in a Michigan bunker? Or is it now time for us to make our own minds up?